The first time I realized they were going to blame me, nobody had actually said my name yet. That was the worst part. Not the accusation itself. Not at first. It was the way a room could lean without moving, the way people who had known you your whole life could go quiet in a shape that already had you standing in the middle of it. But that came later. Earlier that evening when I pulled up in front of my father's house on Whitaker Street, everything still looked like the kind of southern calm people mistake for love. The late sun was laying gold across the white columns. The camellia bushes by the steps had started blooming early, and the front windows were glowing with that warm amber light Celeste liked because it made the house look softer than it was. I sat behind the wheel for a second longer than I needed to, looking at the front door and feeling that old familiar split inside me. Part of me still loved coming there. The other part always had to brace first. I was 25, old enough to know that families could turn a person into a version of herself she did not recognize. In that house, I was still Naomi, but not the Naomi I was downtown at the hotel solving floral disasters and smiling through bride meltdowns and making things look easy for money. At my father's house, I was the softer one, the one who cared too much, the one whose concerns somehow always arrived sounding less intelligent than Grant's opinions. By the time I got out of the car, the front door was already opening. Celeste stood there in cream slacks and a pale blue sweater, set one hand still on the brass handle like she'd timed my arrival to the second. She looked polished in a way that made me instantly aware of my own wrinkled blouse and the humidity-frizzed ends of my ponytail. "Naomi," she said, kissing the air beside my cheek. "You made good time. I left work early. That was probably wise. Your father had a longer day than he should have." Everything with Celeste was like that. Not criticism exactly, just a light touch on the shoulder that somehow always guided you back into the version of events she preferred. Inside, the house smelled like lemon polish, old wood, and the roast chicken Maria had put in the oven before leaving for the day. I heard Grant's voice before I saw him, low and smooth from the back sitting room, followed by my father's shorter answer. Grant came into the hallway with a glass of sparkling water in his hand. Jacket off, sleeves rolled neatly at the forearms, like he had been there long enough to take possession of the evening. He was 11 years older than me, my father's son from his first marriage, and he had spent so many years being treated like the practical one that he had started carrying practicality like a title. "Hey kid," he said. I hated when he called me that. He knew I hated it. "Hi, Grant." His eyes flicked over me with that quick assessing calm of his. "Celeste said you'd been worried." "I am worried." He gave the smallest smile. "He's tired, Naomi. He's 71, not dying." Before I could answer, my father came out behind him, one hand braced lightly against the doorframe. Everything in me softened when I saw him. That was the problem with fathers, I guess. They could fail you in specific lifelong ways and still undo you by looking a little more tired than last week. "Bertie," he said. That was his name for me, not in front of many people, usually only when it was just us or when he forgot himself. I crossed the hall and kissed his cheek. "You look worn out. And you look like you've been bossing around a ballroom." "I do that professionally." His mouth twitched. "Good. Somebody should." That was how it always was with him. With me, he softened. Quietly. Privately. Like tenderness was something he could only risk in partial light. At dinner, the old pattern returned fast. My father barely touched his food. He seemed distracted, more tired than he had on the phone 2 nights earlier, and twice I noticed him pressing his fingers just below his ribs like something there was bothering him. Grant kept redirecting every conversation into logistics. Medication refills. Appointments. The investment property in Bluffton. A bank meeting next week my father apparently did not remember scheduling. I set my fork down. Maybe he doesn't need another meeting next week. Grant didn't even look at me right away. "It's a short one. He looks exhausted. He's still capable of making his own decisions." That isn't what I said. Celeste folded her napkin with delicate precision. "Naomi, your father has always hated being managed." I looked at her. "So why does it feel like everybody here is managing him?" The room went still for one beat. My father looked down at his plate. Grant took a sip of water. Then he said with perfect calm, "There's a difference between helping and hovering." I felt heat rise into my face. "And who gets to decide which one I'm doing?" He gave me that almost sympathetic expression I'd hated since I was 16. Usually the person who isn't leading with emotion. It landed exactly the way he meant it to. Not loud enough to be cruel, just soft enough to make me sound childish if I pushed back. My father cleared his throat. "That's enough." But even then it was not really for me. It was for the table, for the feeling of peace. In our family, peace had always been the prettier cousin of truth. After dinner, Celeste sent me to the kitchen for the tea tray because Maria had already gone home. I took my time coming back mostly because I needed 60 seconds alone. The back hall was dimmer than the front of the house, the light there always a little amber from the old wall sconces my father refused to replace. His study sat at the very end on the left, dark walnut door, brass handle always closed. When I was a kid, I thought treasure lived in there. By the time I was old enough to know better, I understood that what lived in that room was privacy. My father's thoughts, his papers, the part of him nobody got without invitation. Celeste had mentioned earlier that the study was locked because my father had become careless about leaving sensitive documents out. So when I turned the corner and saw the door closing, I stopped. Grant was coming out of the study, not strolling, not casually. He stepped out and pulled the door shut behind him with a careful, controlled movement that made something cold move through me. When he saw me standing there with the silver tray in my hands, his face changed almost too quickly to catch just the slightest flicker. Startle first, then recovery. "Thought you were in the kitchen," he said. I was. He nodded once. Dad wanted the property file from his desk. He forgot he asked me. It was too smooth, too ready. And my father had been in the sitting room the last 15 minutes. I looked at the brass handle. I thought the study was locked. Grant's hand dropped away from it. It was. He gave me the key. Then he walked past me close enough that I caught the clean cedar smell of his cologne and headed toward the front of the house like nothing in the world had shifted. But it had. I brought the tea and set the cups down and tried to act normal while my mind kept replaying the angle of his shoulder, the careful way he had shut the door, the answer waiting too neatly in his mouth. I was still deciding whether to say something when my father reached for his cup and missed the handle completely. The saucer rattled against the table. "Dad," I said. He blinked at me confused, and then his whole face changed. One side seemed to loosen. The cup tipped from his fingers and shattered against the floor. Everything after that came apart fast. Celeste screamed his name. I was already on my knees beside him before the cup stopped rolling. His breathing sounded wrong. His words came out blurred, broken in half. Grant was suddenly in motion, grabbing his phone, barking for towels, telling Celeste to get his medication list, telling me not to move him, as if command itself could turn into love if he spoke firmly enough. At the hospital, fluorescent light flattened all of us into strangers. The doctors moved quickly. Terms like stroke protocol and imaging and critical monitoring passed over our heads. Grant handled admissions. Celeste called people. I sat with my hands locked together so hard my nails left half-moons in my palms. Hours later, sometime after midnight, Grant said Celeste needed to go home and rest for a few hours. I went with her because the idea of staying behind in that waiting room with him made my skin feel too tight. Back at the house, everything looked abandoned in the ugliest possible way. His tea still sat on the table. One of his reading glasses was under the chair. Celeste stood in the doorway of the sitting room with both hands pressed together. Then she frowned. "The study," she said softly. Grant looked up. "What about it? I should check his papers. Daniel will need account information in the morning." I felt it before I understood it. The shift. The thing moving toward me through the room. Grant followed her down the hall. I stood a few steps behind them, not close enough to interrupt, close enough to hear the study door open. Then silence. Not long, just long enough. Celeste turned first. Her face had gone pale beneath her makeup. "Gran," she said very quietly, "the cash box is gone." He moved past her. I saw his eyes skim the room in one fast sweep. Desk drawers, cabinet, safe inset behind the framed map. "The bare envelopes too," he said. Celeste looked at him, then at me. It was nothing. A glance. Barely a second, but I felt the room tilt. No one said my name. No one had to. I stood there with my father's house wrapped around us, with the locked study open at last, and understood two things at the exact same time. They were already building the story without me in it, and if I waited for somebody to be fair, I was going to lose the truth before I even spoke. For a second, I honestly thought I had imagined it, not Grant coming out of the study. I knew I had seen that. What I almost managed to doubt was the look that passed between him and Celeste after she said the cash box was gone. It was so small, so easy to smooth over if you were tired enough, scared enough, eager enough to believe your family would stop before they let something ugly settle on you. But families do not always stop. Sometimes they just lower their voices. By the time we got back to the hospital, the accusations still had not fully formed, and somehow that made it worse. Grant spoke to the night nurse with his usual calm competence. Celeste handled calls from relatives in the clipped, graceful tone she used when she wanted worry to sound dignified. I sat in a vinyl chair under fluorescent lights and felt like I had been pushed 1 inch to the left of my own life. Arthur was stable, they said. Critical but stable. Monitoring overnight, too early to predict much. At around 2 in the morning, Daniel Reyes arrived in a navy overcoat over his suit. Tight, loosened dark hair silvering at the temples the way I remembered from half my childhood. He had been my father's attorney for years, but attorney never covered the whole thing. He was one of the only men my father ever listened to without turning stubborn. "Naomi," he said softly when he saw me and squeezed my shoulder. Grant rose to meet him first, already halfway into explanation. "There's another issue," he said. "Something missing from the study." Daniel's eyes shifted to Celeste, then to me. Celeste lowered her voice. "A cash box. Several bearer envelopes. We haven't made any formal assumptions, but clearly, we need to establish who had access." Formal assumptions. It was almost elegant the way she made suspicion sound like paperwork. Daniel glanced at me again, longer this time. "Who had access?" Grant answered before anyone else could. "That's part of the problem. My father's been more forgetful lately. Doors left unlocked. Keys misplaced. Naomi was at the house all evening. There was some tension at dinner. He did not look at me when he said it. That was what made it cruel. He sounded like a man trying to help a room organize information. I heard my own voice come out too fast. I was at the house because I came to see my father, not because I was stealing from him." Grant finally turned, then expression composed. "No one said you were. No one said it, and yet there I was having to answer it." Daniel's face changed in a way I could not read. Not agreement. Not disbelief. Just caution. Professional caution, which in that moment felt like another kind of abandonment. Celeste touched my arm lightly. "Naomi, no one is trying to upset you. We just need clarity." There it was again. That word, as if clarity were something I owed them because my existence had become inconvenient. I stood up so quickly, the chair legs scraped the tile. "I need air." No one stopped me. Outside, the hospital lot was damp from a recent mist, and the cold reached right through my blouse. I called Iris before I could talk myself out of it. She picked up on the second ring, voice thick with sleep. "Naomi." I swallowed. "They think I took something from my father." Her voice changed instantly. What I told her, everything in a rush at first, the study, the missing cash box, the way Grant kept offering facts that were really conclusions in nice shoes. By the time I got to the end, I was shaking so hard, my teeth clicked once. "Okay," she said. "Start over. I just told you no. Start over with what you saw, not what you think it means." I closed my eyes, leaned against the brick wall near the entrance, tried again. I came out of the kitchen with the tea tray. I turned into the back hall. The study door was almost shut. Grant stepped out and pulled it closed behind him. He looked startled for maybe half a second. I said I thought the study was locked. He said Dad gave him the key because he wanted a property file from the desk. "Did your father ask for that file in front of you?" "No." "Did Grant say anything else?" He walked past me like it was normal. "Good," she said. "That is not good. It is. If you need to remember it clearly. Naomi, listen to me. Stop trying to explain your innocence in general. Hold on to what happened in sequence. People like Grant live in the blur. Don't meet him there." I pressed my hand over my mouth for a second. The crying came close, then passed. "You believe me. I believe that you notice things before you know what they mean. That has literally always been true about you. When I went back inside, nothing was better, but something in me had steadied. Hurt was still there. Shame too. But now it had edges." The next morning, after a few hours of broken sleep in the family waiting room, I returned to the house with Celeste while Grant stayed behind to talk to one of the doctors. The Mercer house looked almost offended by daylight. Too composed. Too polished. Like it had already decided to survive this with its posture intact. Celeste moved through the downstairs in silence, gathering papers Daniel had requested. Insurance information, account contacts, Arthur's medication list. I watched her unlock the study and then set the key on the desk while she sorted through a drawer. 10 minutes later, when she left to answer a call in the foyer, the key was no longer there. I noticed because I had started noticing everything. When Grant came back to the house an hour later, he walked straight down the back hall without asking whether the study was open. He stopped only when he saw me in the doorway. "I thought Celeste locked that," I said. His gaze flicked once to the brass handle. "I was checking whether Daniel's contact sheet was still inside. You seem pretty sure it was." A pause. Tiny. Then his mouth curved in a way that wasn't a smile. "You're tired." Maybe I was, but tired people still saw patterns. At lunch, Celeste told Daniel over the phone that the study had remained locked except for when Arthur himself needed something, or when Grant was specifically asked to help. The problem was that was not what she had said the night before. Last night it had been all concern about misplaced keys and Arthur getting forgetful. Now the study was secure again. The facts kept changing shape depending on which version protected the household best. By late afternoon, I found myself standing in my father's bedroom looking at the cufflinks on his dresser and a folded pair of reading glasses and the navy cardigan he always reached for when the air conditioning ran too cold. On the nightstand was a legal pad with a grocery list on top. Page, coffee, batteries, orange stamps. But when I lifted it, the pressure of his pen had left faint impressions on the sheet below. Trust revision. Daniel, access. Review before Friday. I froze. The writing was his, not the grocery list. The deeper marks beneath it. I took the pad to the window and tilted it against the light until the indented words became clearer. Grant was not one of them, but he did not need to be. The absence was loud enough. I took a picture with my phone and called Daniel before I could lose my nerve. He answered from his office voice, quieter now, less guarded. Naomi, I found something in my father's room. Not proof exactly, but not nothing either. There was a brief silence on the line. Then your father asked to see me twice in the last month outside our usual schedule. My grip tightened around the phone. About what? About restructuring access to certain liquid assets, tightening authority, delaying discretionary withdrawals if he became incapacitated. My heart gave one hard, sick beat. Because of Grant, I asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. He did not name him directly. Your father was a careful man when he was late to certainty, but he told me he felt pressure around timing, around being hurried. He said he wanted to make sure kindness was not mistaken for permission. I sat down on the edge of the bed because my knees had gone strange. He knew, I whispered. I think Daniel said carefully that he had begun to worry. After we hung up, I went back to the study for the first time alone. It still smelled faintly of his aftershave and old paper. The desk was too neat in the way neatness becomes suspicious once you know somebody has gone through it already. In the bottom right drawer under a stack of account folders Celeste had likely not touched because they look boring. I found a manila file with no label. Inside were drafts, not final documents, notes in my father's hand, a partially prepared instruction sheet. A line crossed out and rewritten harder beneath it, Naomi's distribution to remain separate from Grant's review authority. I stared at that sentence until the words stopped looking like language and started looking like a wound. He had seen it. He had seen enough to move quietly enough to fear what Grant might do with access enough to protect me on paper before he protected me in a room. And Grant must have known or guessed something was changing, something narrowing around him, something he no longer controlled. This was not a son panicking over money. This was a man stepping in before the door closed on him, then letting the easiest person in the house carry the shadow of what he had done. I stood there in the locked study with the file in my hands and felt grief shift into something sharper and steadier. Not relief. Relief would have meant less damage. This was worse than I had thought and clearer. By the time I heard Grant's footsteps in the hall, I already knew I was no longer trying to prove a misunderstanding. I was standing in the middle of a betrayal that had started before my father ever hit the floor, and if I wanted the truth to survive it, I was going to have to stop begging this family to see me clearly and make them answer what they had done. I turned before Grant reached the doorway and said, "Don't touch anything." He stopped just outside the study, one hand still loose at his side, expression unreadable in that infuriating way of his. Behind him the hall was washed in late daylight, the kind that made the old wood glow, like the house was trying to look honorable. "Naomi," he said almost gently, "you need to get some sleep." "No." I held the folder tighter. "What I need is for you not to keep talking to me like I'm confused." Something in my voice must have been different because he did not step farther in. He just looked at me for a second longer than usual, then said, "Whatever you think you found now is not the time." That would have worked on me 24 hours earlier. The timing argument, the civility argument, the idea that truth could always be postponed until it became useless. I walked past him into the hall. Actually, now is exactly the time. Celeste was in the front sitting room when I found her still in the same pale blouse from that morning, her posture perfect in the armchair by the window, like exhaustion was something that happened to less disciplined women. She looked up when she saw my face, then at the folder in my hand. "Naomi," she said carefully, "if this is about another emotional scene, it's not a scene." My voice came out low and level. "I want you and Grant in the study, and I want Daniel here too." Her mouth tightened. "Daniel has gone back to his office, then call him." She stared at me, maybe waiting for me to crack and become the version of myself this family always found easier to handle. When I didn't, something flickered behind her eyes. Uncertainty, maybe. Or the first hint of shame. Why, she asked. Because I'm done having this house rearranged me. Grant had followed me in. This is inappropriate. I turned to him. That word has done a lot of work for you. For once, he didn't have an immediate answer. Daniel came 40 minutes later. By then the light outside had gone thin and grey and the study lamps threw a softer circle over the desk, the leather chair, the frame maps on the walls. My father's room had always felt like the one place in the house where nobody performed. Standing there now with all of them, I realized that was exactly why I wanted the confrontation inside it. If the truth was going to survive, it needed to happen in the one room my father had kept for judgment instead of display. Daniel closed the door quietly behind him. Celeste stood near the bookshelves with both hands clasped in front of her. Grant stayed closest to the desk, like proximity itself still belonged to him. I did not sit. I want to say this once, I said. So I'd appreciate it if nobody interrupted until I'm finished. Grant exhaled through his nose. Naomi. I looked at him. You've had the floor the entire time. That shut him up. My heart was beating hard enough to hurt, but my mind felt strangely clean, like all the panic had burned away and left only sequence. The night Dad collapsed, I said, I came out of the kitchen with the tea tray and saw Grant leaving this room. He closed the door behind him and told me Dad had sent him for a property file. Grant gave a short, tired smile, which he did. No, I said, he didn't, because Dad was in the sitting room with me for the 15 minutes before that and he never asked. Also, Celeste had already said the study was locked because sensitive documents had been left out. Celeste shifted slightly. Naomi, that doesn't, it matters because the facts keep changing. I kept my eyes on her now. That night the study was supposedly locked, but keys had been misplaced. The next day, when Daniel needed account information, suddenly the study had remained secure except when Arthur specifically asked Grant to help. Which version are we using? Celeste went still. Grant's voice stayed maddeningly calm. This is exactly what I was worried about. She's taking fragments and building a story because she needs someone to blame. I nodded once. That's what you do, isn't it? You take fragments and build a story that sounds reasonable enough to survive a room. His face changed then. Barely. Just a tightening around the mouth. I opened the folder and laid the documents on the desk one by one. The legal pad photo first, then the draft instruction sheet, then the page with my father's handwritten note about my distribution remaining separate from Grant's review authority. I found these, I said, not in some hidden safe, not because I went hunting for a melodramatic secret. I found them because Dad had started changing things, and someone had already been through this room. Grant laughed once softly in disbelief. Drafts, half notes, that's what this is. You dragged Daniel over here for speculation. Daniel spoke then for the first time. Your father met with me twice in the past month about restricting access to certain liquid assets if he became incapacitated. The room changed. Grant turned toward him too fast. Restricting whose access? Daniel held his gaze. He did not put every concern in blunt language, but he made it clear he felt pressure and wanted protections in place. Celeste looked from Daniel to the papers to me. Her face had lost all color. Arthur never told me that. No, I said. And this was the part that hurt most, the part I had not been able to outrun even while preparing for this. He didn't tell you, and he didn't tell me either. He just started trying to fix it quietly, which left a perfect space for Grant to move first. Grant gave me a flat look. You are making an enormous leap. No, my voice stayed steady. I'm making the first honest one. I stepped closer to the desk. You knew he was changing something. Maybe not every detail, but enough. Enough to go into this room before he collapsed. Enough to take the cash box and the bearer envelopes before you lost the chance. And when he got sick earlier than you expected, you did what you always do. You shifted tone. You made yourself sound responsible. You let everybody keep believing I was too emotional to trust. That is not what happened. Then why did you already know what was missing? I asked. Silence. Not long, but long enough. I pressed on before he could rebuild. Celeste said the cash box was gone. Then you immediately said the bearer envelopes were missing too. She had not mentioned them yet. You knew what had been taken because you were the one who took it. Grant's eyes cut toward Celeste, then Daniel, then back to me. That proves nothing. It proves you knew the inventory of a room that was supposedly private and secured. I swallowed once. And even if I had said nothing, even if I had just sat there and cried, like you wanted, you still would have let this settle on me. Celeste let out a small broken breath. Grant heard it too, and something in him snapped, not loudly, not theatrically, but enough. "Oh, please," he said. "You all act like Arthur was some crystal-clear strategist." He was slipping. He was getting paranoid. Naomi fluttered in here with her feelings every week, and suddenly I'm supposed to believe he wanted major decisions influenced by that. I didn't move. Neither did Daniel. Grant looked at the papers with contempt. He was no longer bothering to hide. He was tired. He was irrational. And yes, maybe I moved things before he signed himself into a mess. Because someone in this family actually understands what responsibility looks like. There it was. Not panic, not desperation, entitlement, clean and cold. Celeste sat down abruptly in the leather chair behind her as if her legs had given out. "Grant," she said, almost whispering. "Do you hear yourself?" He looked at her, incredulous. "Do you?" But now that the mask was off, he could not get it back on. Everything he said only made the shape underneath clearer. Daniel gathered the papers slowly. "I think that's enough for tonight." Grant's laugh came sharp this time. "Is it?" "Yes," Daniel said. "It is." No one raised a voice after that. No one needed to. The truth had crossed the room and taken its place. Whatever happened next, lawyers' restitution consequences would happen outside the moment that mattered most. Inside that study, the real thing had already occurred. I was no longer the easiest lie in the room. Arthur woke the following afternoon. Not fully, not all at once. The doctors still spoke in careful language, but when I went into his room, his eyes opened and found me with enough recognition to take the breath out of my chest. I sat beside the bed and took his hand carefully, afraid of all the machines, all the fragility. His skin felt papery and warm. "Hi," I said, and my voice broke on the single syllable. His fingers moved weakly against mine. For a minute, I could not say anything else. Everything I had wanted from him for years seemed too large and too late and too childish all at once. An apology, an explanation, a declaration that he had seen me clearly the whole time. In the end, what came out was the truest thing. "I know," I whispered. "I know you were trying." His eyes filled before mine did. He blinked slowly once, then looked at our joined hands. His mouth moved with effort. "Birdie," he said. Just that. My old name. Then, after a long pause that seemed to cost him, "Should have said it." The tears came then, hot and immediate. I lowered my head and pressed his hand to my cheek for a second, careful not to disturb the IV tape there. "Yes," I said. "You should have." He closed his eyes briefly, not in refusal, just in exhaustion. When he opened them again, he squeezed my fingers as hard as he could, which was almost nothing and more than enough. A week later, I stood on the front porch of the Mercer house at dusk while the lawyer's car pulled away from the curb. Inside, things had changed without becoming healed. Grant was gone from the house, though not from the family history. Celeste moved more quietly now, as if every polished surface accused her of something she had not wanted to see. She had apologized once, carefully, sincerely, and not nearly enough. I had accepted it to the extent truth required and not 1 inch farther. The camellias by the steps were still blooming. The evening air smelled like rain and old leaves in the river somewhere beyond the neighborhood. Through the front window, I could see the hall lamp burning, and beyond it, just barely, the closed door of the study. For most of my life, I had thought belonging meant being gently kept inside a family's walls, even if they never named your place correctly. I knew better now. Love that only survives in private is not protection. Silence is not safety just because it comes dressed like peace. I put my hand on the porch rail, worn smooth by decades of weather and use, and looked back at the house one last time before stepping down into the darkening yard. It was still my father's house. It was still the place where I had been made smaller and where finally I had refused to stay that way. The first porch light came on across the street. Somewhere nearby, a screen door shut and a dog barked once. Ordinary sounds. Evening settling over everything. I stood there another second with the cool air against my face and the last of the light fading soft across the columns, and for the first time in that house I did not feel erased.